Hello and welcome to MEELive. I'm Matilda Mallinson. It's Thursday, the 9th of July, 2026. Today is the US-Iran war back on. That and other key takeaways from NATO. First, the headlines. The US has launched 2 rounds of strikes on Iran after President Trump said on Wednesday that the ceasefire is over. Days of escalating retaliatory strikes began on Tuesday, triggered by Iranian fire in the Strait of Hormuz. Bahrain, Kuwait and Qatar have again come into the crossfire. At the NATO summit in Turkey, Trump called Iran's leaders scum and warned attacks could get much worse if Iran continued to target ships in the strait, a key sticking point in the fragile truce between the two countries. While the US wants free navigation, Iran is attempting to retain its control in the long term for financial and political leverage. Trump's ceasefire rejection was not the only news to come out of the NATO summit in Ankara. The US president also announced Syria would be removed from the list of state sponsors of terrorism after nearly 50 years under the designation. Branded a historic move, the removal would abandon export restrictions on defense-related items and allow the US to deliver more foreign aid into the country. It is the latest in a series of steps repealing sanctions on Syria and fostering closer cooperation between the countries since the fall of Assad in December 2024. The swift progress is largely credited to Trump's apparent fondness for Syria's interim leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa. The admiration was on full display at the NATO summit, with Trump calling Sharaa a fantastic and highly respected leader. It follows controversial comments from Trump that he would like Syria to enter Lebanon in order to disarm Hezbollah. President Sharaa has insisted he will not do so. More on both NATO and the US-Iran war coming up. But first, Nigel Farage is running against a rubbish bin in a surprise by-election triggered by the Reform leader's resignation on Tuesday. Count Binface's manifesto pledges include all 99 flake ice creams to cost no more than 99p, people who use speakerphones on public transport to be conscripted, and building at least one affordable house. Farage resigned amid an investigation into undisclosed millions donated by one crypto billionaire and another convicted money launderer. His resignation speech sought the high ground.
No, I've decided that the people of Clacton should be the judges of my actions. This will be a people versus the establishment by-election.
Farage flatly denies any wrongdoing.
Frankly, it is like living in a communist country. I could never have believed such a thing would happen here.
Rival parties have called his resignation a stunt and are boycotting the by-election. But according to Farage, they're running away from the battle because they know they would be annihilated.
I think your viewers are going to be thinking, my goodness me, did we all just stay up too late watching England-Mexico? We all haven't had enough sleep and it's just one giant fever dream. Maybe this is just a group hallucination.
Next up, NATO. The 2026 NATO summit concluded in Ankara on Wednesday, and this year one phrase has been making the rounds: NATO 3.0. In the wake of the Cold War, NATO updated its readiness plans in a shift often described as NATO 2.0. This year, Secretary General Mark Rutte described 3.0 as a stronger Europe in a stronger NATO, one less dependent on the United States. Yet, US President Donald Trump still dominated the tone. Yes, he still wants Greenland. No, he doesn't want any trade with Spain, which he called a country of hopeless bad people. He also insulted France, Germany, Italy and the UK for declining to join his war on Iran. But he took a very different tone with the summit host, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, praising what he called the loyalty of the Turks compared to other NATO allies. This was a significant summit for Turkey, the first time it hosted NATO since 2004. So has NATO revived Turkey's place in Europe? And has Turkey revived NATO from the disinterest of Donald Trump? Joining me now from Washington is MEE journalist Yasmin El-Sabawi. Yasmin, welcome to MEELive. So Trump says he's removing Turkey from a US blacklist that he himself imposed. This was because Turkey acquired Russian S-400 defense systems, very controversial given Russia's relationship with NATO. How significant is this move by Trump?
It's hugely significant. And look, it's not like he hasn't signaled this before, but what was different here is that he sat right next to President Erdogan. He looked at reporters and he said, we're going to remove the sanctions. It's time. This is a valued friend, and this is what we're going to do. And so it was quite explicit. These were also sanctions that were put in place during Trump's first term back in 2019. This was, as you mentioned, because Turkey acquired the S-400 Russian defense system. They say it's because the U.S. didn't supply them with their own defense system. They would have preferred to take it from a NATO ally, but of course, having a Russian system in place, according to the Americans, becomes a concern, because then any program that Turkey is in that is a NATO program, such as the F-35, those elite fighter jet training programs, that would potentially expose some U.S. intelligence, I should say, to Moscow. And that is something the U.S. wants to avoid. But now, as Trump leans into that personal relationship with Erdogan, becoming perhaps the most pro-Turkey president that the U.S. has ever seen, he's certainly leaning into that, looking to move it through Congress before the midterm elections, when we expect Democrats to take hold of both chambers on Capitol Hill.
Well, so if Turkey finds its way back onto the exclusive F-35s program as a result of this, presumably Israel won't be very happy.
No, not at all. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has made this very clear. He has said Israel must maintain air superiority in the region. He went as far in a Fox and Friends interview last week to say that to align Turkey with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is shorthand in Israel for links to terrorism. He has said that Turkey does not share the values that are within NATO. And so that is something that surely the pro-Israeli lobby here in the U.S. will be pushing, especially among Democrats. Democrats is where you may see more of the pushback when it comes to removing Turkey from the sanctions list, bringing them back into the F-35 fold, because Republicans at this point, as we've seen, tend to go with what the president wants, particularly on foreign policy, even if there is some mild pushback. At the end of the day, they're seeking the president's endorsement. This is an election year for members of Congress. The president remains the kingmaker.
Now, at the heart of this story is this intriguing solidarity between Trump and Erdogan. You said Trump might be the most pro-Turkey president the US has ever seen. He said that he only showed up to NATO for his friend Erdogan. What is at the heart of this relationship? Why do this pair seem to get on so well?
I think you see the term strongman thrown around a lot, which very much describes who Trump is, very much describes Erdogan, who, of course, began as prime minister, became the president, has been in power for 20 years. Most of what he says goes, much as Trump would like. We've seen Trump in the past, perhaps not so jokingly, suggest that he would like to be president for life, as some of the other leaders are. He mentioned President Xi of China. So in that vein, he does see a similarity. These are men that want to be in place for a very long time. He sees Erdogan as someone who's also reliable because he has been in power for so long, whereas with Europe, with so many other prime ministers, all it takes is one vote of non-confidence and they're out, and that triggers an election. But in Turkey, that's been very different. The president has found himself with someone who doesn't criticize his policies as much as Western Europe does.
Mainly, in the meantime, NATO's European members, the democratic ones in particular, they are treading very thin ice with Trump, who's been threatening to withdraw US troops from Europe. He reiterated his desire to own Greenland. Amid this strife, is Erdogan becoming a little bit of a lifeline for NATO?
Certainly, and you've seen that with the French also moving a little closer to Turkey. And they were major critics of Turkey's, some of its democratic backsliding, some of aspects of Erdogan's rule, where they had said that he had ruled with an iron fist, that he's clamping down on any critics. Because at the end of the day, when the United States moves closer toward an ally, it's hard for the rest of the alliance not to go in the same direction. Washington very much has dictated NATO's direction. And you've seen that the president also mentioned to allies that that's why he also wants them to step up their contributions to defense spending in NATO, because the fact is the U.S. has led the way financially and politically within this alliance. And Turkey, of course, remains just geographically incredibly important. It has also stepped up as a power player because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's orchestrated some prisoner swaps, and it wants to play a larger role given it has maintained a friendship with both sides.
Now, you mentioned that in the past, Europe has been quite critical of Turkey, particularly Erdogan, due to his increasingly repressive treatment of the domestic opposition. Now, this summit was accompanied by a pretty harsh crackdown on protesters and even potential protesters who might appear at NATO. So did that criticism appear, or were these European critics quieter this time around?
We did see a reporter put this question to the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte just yesterday on Wednesday, saying, you know, you sat right there next to Donald Trump. Why not bring up some of the problematic issues? Why not criticize some of his policies if you feel so strongly about them? Because the reporter essentially said, you know, you sit next to him, all you do is praise the man. And Rutte only responded that it's important to praise the United States when necessary. But we also know this is how you bring Trump on side. And one of the key words that he used to describe President Erdogan and Turkey is loyal. And that's incredibly important to someone like President Trump, who also applies the same standard domestically in the United States.
Now, efforts to prevent unrest were not entirely successful in Ankara. Anti-NATO protests took place not just in Ankara, also in Istanbul, in Izmir. There were labor unions, there were NGOs critical of military budgets increasing. But there was also another issue in play. That was Gaza. Erdogan presents himself as a champion of the Palestinian cause. This should, by many accounts, put him at loggerheads with Trump. Why is Gaza not more of an issue between the pair?
This is what makes this relationship so fascinating. We've seen the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan sort of package the Gaza issue as something that the U.S. and Turkey are aligned on, which is quite fascinating. But he mentioned this just after the meeting, or the inaugural meeting of the Board of Peace earlier this year. Turkey was one of the first signatories. It didn't manage to insert its troops into this ISF, or the International Stabilization Force that the Board of Peace intends to have in Gaza. But it does want to play a bigger role, and to do that, you have to stay in Trump's good orbit. And part of that is about bringing up the commonalities, staying on message, reminding him that he is in fact somebody who has created peace, has brought about the ceasefire. This is the narrative you have to craft around Trump. This is the narrative he wants around himself. And much of how he works is based on personal relationships, which comes back to Erdogan, and also the cultural notion of within Turkey of maintaining the personal relationships to eventually get what you want.
Thank you. And now finally, let's talk about Syria. There was another big key winner at NATO, and that was Syria, with the US now moving to delist it as a state sponsor of terrorism. Tell us about this. How significant is this?
It's hugely significant. I would argue it is perhaps the most impactful deliverable from the NATO summit. This came right after a meeting between President Trump and President Shara. President Trump, as you had mentioned earlier, praised him in a way we haven't seen him talk about any Western European leader or any other ally, frankly, to call him highly respected, to call him fantastic. And remember, a year and a half ago, this was somebody who had a $10 million bounty on his head. But the swift embrace of Ahmed Shara has been nothing short of remarkable. Perhaps no other president would have dared to take this on, but Trump has lifted economic sanctions, those really crippling Caesar sanctions, and now we see him beginning the formal process to delist Syria from the state sponsors of terrorism list. It only has 4 countries on it. It's North Korea, Iran, Cuba, and Syria. So this is really something that's historic. It's rare, but it will have to go through Congress. We don't expect a lot of opposition here. There is bipartisan support for this in order to spur private investment and to just bring Syria back up to where it belongs.
Certainly a huge development. Yasmin El-Sabawi, thank you so much for your time. Now, there was, of course, one other major outcome from the NATO summit.
I don't want to deal with them anymore. They're scum. You know what scum is? They're scum. They're sick people. They're led by sick people. And they're vicious, violent people. And if they had a nuclear weapon, they'd use it. As far as I'm concerned, it's over. They're liars. They're cheats. They're sick people.
Trump left Turkey on the old Air Force One instead of his new Qatari-donated plane, a security precaution taken due to renewed hostilities with Iran. As of this morning, the US-Iran ceasefire has effectively collapsed, and the two sides have exchanged strikes for a second consecutive day. Both sides blame the other for the breakdown, and across news media, there is sharp divergence over who was the key provocateur. So here's the timeline. On Tuesday, two tankers, one Qatari, the other Saudi, were struck by projectiles in the Strait of Hormuz. Qatar accused Iran. US CENTCOM responded by striking around 80 Iranian targets. Iranian state media reported 8 military casualties. Simultaneously, the US Treasury reimposed sanctions less than 3 weeks after the deal was signed. Iran's IRGC responded overnight, targeting 85 US military sites in Bahrain and Kuwait. And then on Wednesday, Trump told NATO the Memorandum of Understanding was over and the Iranian government was scum. He threatened to reimpose the naval blockade and strike Iran's electricity and water plants. 1 hour later, the US launched the largest wave of attacks, hitting the cities of Iran Shah, Bandar Abbas, Kanarak, Chabar, Bashir, and Ak-Kala. Markets reacted sharply. Brent crude rose to around $78 a barrel. Even before the US strikes, divisions were emerging within Iran's leadership between those who favor negotiation with Washington and hardliners who oppose a deal. The 6-day funeral of late Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei saw imagery openly wishing harm on the US President Donald Trump. And Washington is also divided between peace and war, with little to show from the first 3 months of fire and stagnant negotiations ever since. What are they still hoping to gain? Will they gain it? And what are their options besides war? I'm joined now by US political scientist and professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, Stephen M Walt. Stephen, welcome to MEELive. It's great to have you. Can you just explain to us, how is it that Iran is continually able to stand up to the US, particularly in the Strait of Hormuz, despite the US clearly being the superior military power?
Well, it's primarily because, first of all, this is an existential danger for Iran. They see this as a struggle for survival, whereas for the United States, it was a war of choice from the very beginning. It was not a war where American vital interests were really engaged, and that means Iran's willing to bear enormous pain and pay an enormous price to stay in the fight. The second reason, of course, is the United States actually has limited military options here. It can't invade Iran because it would take enormous casualties if it did that. It can't shut off Iran's ability to threaten shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. If we could do that, we would have done that already. So there are real limits here. And in fact, the Trump administration is, I think, running out of targets. They can now start attacking civilian infrastructure and even civilians themselves in Iran, but that would be a war crime as well. So in a sense, America, despite its enormous military advantage, has real limits here in terms of the actual leverage. And then finally, add to that the fact that the United States, and especially President Trump, is worried about the economic consequences of higher energy prices, on what that means for the midterm elections in November. So his incentive to try and keep this under control, try and limit this, and eventually get the strait open is, I think, higher than Iran's. For all those reasons, the United States doesn't have the leverage you might think it would, given the disparity in each side's capabilities.
What does this tell us about the strategic value of Trump returning to war and indeed initiating war in the first place?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that he's just reacting to events. I mean, his behavior and his statements throughout the war have been incredibly erratic. Sometimes he has called the Iranian leadership reasonable and says they want a deal. You showed the clip of him at the NATO summit calling them scum and saying they're very bad people and that they're liars as well. So if you're the Iranians, you can't really take anything the president says seriously because he's been all over the map there. The second problem here is there is zero trust between these two governments, especially on the Iranian side. Remember that this war began with Israel and the United States killing most of Iran's senior leaders. That is not exactly the way you encourage confidence. And Iran is in a position where they're not going to believe any American promises unless they're really convinced the United States is going to stick to them. And the best way for Iran to do that, I think, in their minds, is to make sure that the United States pays a large price for this war and therefore learns never to do this sort of thing again. And that means they're going to drive a very hard bargain, and they're going to want a lot of buy-in from other countries as well before they're going to declare the war ultimately over.
There's a long-running debate about how much US policy towards Iran is driven by Netanyahu and by Israeli lobbying in Washington. How would you characterize that influence, and where do people get it wrong?
Well, that influence has been extraordinary in this particular case. I mean, we know, I think, quite clearly that President Trump was persuaded to start the war after a long briefing that he got in the White House from Prime Minister Netanyahu, basically convincing him that it was going to be easy, that the Iranian regime would collapse quickly, and this would be a great strategic victory. So in that sense, Israel, I think, was quite critical to this. And second, yes, the pro-Israeli lobby in the United States, especially the hardline parts of that lobby, had been pushing for a war with Iran for a long time and building the case that this was absolutely vital for the United States as well, which I think has never actually been true. It is important, and this is the place where people get it wrong, it is important to recognize that not every pro-Israel organization supported the war. For example, J Street came out immediately with a statement condemning the war because I think they correctly understood this was not the way to solve these problems as well. So when you are hoping to attribute responsibility for the war, you want to be very careful to focus only on those people who actively pushed for it and not the people who were skeptical or who opposed it.
And of course, US has a long-standing tradition of there being a very strong domestic pro-war voice in Washington. The same voices who championed the Iraq War were prominent advocates for this one, and they received just as much platforming with no accountability for their historic errors. This is as you argue in foreign policy. Why does the US foreign policy establishment, why does the US media keep listening to people if they keep getting it wrong?
That's an extraordinarily good question. I mean, in the American elite, there has not been a lot of accountability in the past. People who have failed repeatedly in policy positions can get reappointed. It's a very self-protective elite in a variety of ways. And I think a lot of media figures, media organizations, rely on the same familiar names in reporters' Rolodexes or address books. And they repeatedly want to try and show that they listen to both sides. So people who have been advocating war for a long time still get paid attention to, even when the wars they've advocated for go very badly. It's, I think, a huge problem for the United States that we can't hold our public officials to greater account. And this, I think, is just another example of the consequences of that.
If we do consider seriously the reasons for going to war in the first place, if the result is some kind of nuclear agreement, would that at least be a success worth the cost?
It's almost certainly not worth the cost because, remember, we had a good nuclear agreement with Iran before, and Donald Trump tore it up during his first term. We're not going to get a deal with Iran going forward that's substantially different from that. And the cost has been enormous. Americans have paid, over $500 billion in excess energy costs already. The Trump administration is asking for $70 billion more to pay the direct costs of the war. Other other economies around the world have been affected by this in lots of ways due to the higher energy prices, loss of fertilizer, etc. So to expend all of those costs, and by the way, to let Iran demonstrate that it has the capacity to control the Strait of Hormuz going forward, all of that is on the cost side, and to basically go back to an agreement that's very similar to the one that we had carefully negotiated under President Obama is not what I would call a strategic victory.
Okay, so what alternatives are there to resuming warfare, given the ongoing confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz? If you were advising the White House this week, what off-ramp would you propose to Trump?
The off-ramp here is that we have to recognize we made a big mistake, that we shouldn't have gone to war in the first place. And when you make a big mistake, you don't get out of it without paying a substantial price. The United States needs to establish a reasonable regime for control of shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. It's going to have to negotiate that with Iran, and Iran has a lot of leverage. It's going to have to reach an agreement on Iran's nuclear capabilities, which will, in my view, allow Iran to continue to enrich, but place real limits, along with IAEA inspections on what they're actually allowed to possess. And so in a sense, we're going to be going back very much to something similar to the agreement that we reached before. But of course, that's now going to be done in a situation where the United States doesn't have the same kind of leverage, and it won't be as good a deal as we got. But I would tell President Trump to cut his losses, get the war over, and don't do something like this again.
Wouldn't that essentially, though, require Trump to admit that he was wrong? Is that something you see Trump doing?
Well, he won't ever admit he was wrong, but if there's any American president who's been good at backtracking, at reversing course and getting people to go along with him, even if what he's doing is an obvious retreat, it's Donald Trump. So no, he's not, in most cases, willing to admit error. Here, I think he'll pretend it's a victory and hope everybody can get distracted by his next outrageous activity.
And so you mentioned other US presidents there. I suppose a question I have is, does this war on Iran, does it fit into a broader pattern in how the US uses military force? Or is it a one-off, a particular situation driven by this particular president in this particular moment?
Well, I think it's actually consistent with some past mistakes we have made, most notably the war with Iraq, but you could also add the long war in Afghanistan, which ultimately ended badly. And I'd make the broader point that this is another example of how aggressive wars are increasingly pointless. They don't seem to accomplish what their initiators are trying to achieve. That was true when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. It was true when Russia invaded Ukraine. It's true for us in a number of different cases, and it's even true in some civil wars like in Sudan or in Libya, that given the nature of modern warfare, the power of national resistance, the changing nature of military technology, it's becoming increasingly difficult for even powerful states to impose their will on others and come out of it actually ahead. I think the lesson here is that actually staying out of wars is the way that countries benefit. And I think if you look at how China has acted over the last 30 or 40 years, staying out of wars has been a great benefit to them. It's a lesson the rest of us might want to take more seriously.
So soft power, not hard power, not exactly Donald Trump's personal strength.
Hard power is still important, but it needs to be used very sparingly and to defend interests, not to try and attack, conquer, and dominate others.
Stephen Walt, thank you so much for joining us. Now, as the US's role in the Middle East grows ever more unpredictable, its allies in the region are forging their own paths forward. More than 4 months into the Iran war, two countries in particular have pursued very different strategies to cope with the fallout. MEE journalist Sean Matthews explains who those countries are and why they seem to disagree about what lies ahead in the Middle East.
Saudi Arabia once tried to bribe a prince of the UAE's Al Nahyan family to cede control of a desert oasis suspected of containing vast quantities of oil. The sheikh rejected the offer to betray his family, and Saudi Arabia launched a failed invasion of the territory. That is how the late journalist David Holden summed up the legendary 1950s Bahraini dispute between the Saudi royal family, Oman, and the Trucial states, which would become the United Arab Emirates, in his classic 1966 book, Farewell to Arabia. The sheikh the Saudi Arabians tried to bribe, by Holden's telling, was Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, then known as the Lord of Brahmi, but remembered in history as the founder of the UAE. His son, President Mohammed bin Zayed, is now locked in his own nasty spat with another Saudi family member, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The two Gulf states are at loggerheads in almost every theater imaginable in the Middle East, from the coast of the Red Sea to war-torn Yemen and global energy markets. Diplomats and business people say their feud will play a major role in defining the Middle East's future, particularly as the United States' staying power in the region is called into question by the US-Israeli war in Iran. The divergence between these two states may even impact the pocketbooks of consumers in Asia, Europe, and the US. Look no further than the UAE's decision to pull out of the Saudi Arabian-led oil cartel, OPEC, in May. On the surface, Abu Dhabi left OPEC after 60 years because it differed with Riyadh over how to manage production. The UAE has invested heavily in capacity so it can produce a greater amount of oil. Abu Dhabi wants to increase production and take profits now in the belief that the oil in the ground might be worth less in 2 or 3 decades. Saudi Arabia has more than double the oil reserves of the UAE and wants to manage global supply to support prices long term. But beneath these technicalities lie a fundamental difference. OPEC was founded by Saudi Arabia and other countries, including Iraq and Venezuela, in 1960. The 7 emirates that comprised the UAE were once known as the Trucial States. They were some of Britain's last colonial possessions. The UAE was not declared a state until 1971. Over the last 50 years, the UAE has emerged as an energy powerhouse, but also a global business and tourism hub. Dubai's successful utilization of its oil revenue in the 1970s and the 1980s to become a trade and finance entrepot is the model for many Gulf states today, as they look to diversify their economies. For centuries, the families and tribes that inhabited the Gulf Coast were wary of the tribes of Najd, the Central Arabian region from which the Al Saud family hails. Now, the UAE believes it has outgrown deferring to Saudi Arabia. President Mohammed bin Zayed approach to the region, some analysts say, is a 21st century spin of older rivalries, turbocharged by oil wealth and technology. In 2009, the UAE withdrew from the Gulf Cooperation Council Monetary Union project, dealing a blow to plans for a single Gulf currency. The UAE was angry that the council's headquarters would be in Riyadh rather than Abu Dhabi. But many outside observers have been surprised by the reappearance of the UAE-Saudi Arabian rift. That is because, for a short period of time, both countries cohered in opposing the Arab Spring protest movements that swept across the Middle East in 2011, which they believed threatened regional stability and their monarchies. They also saw a common enemy in Iran. In 2014, they joined forces to launch war against Houthis in Yemen, who they saw as Iranian proxies. Diplomats and analysts say the two countries' coherence was helped by the fact that President Mohammed bin Zayed took the younger Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman under his wing in 2015. As he was coming to power. That moment has faded. Saudi Arabia has grown wary of the UAE's attempt to increase its power across the region by supporting proxies operating outside of state institutions. For example, in Yemen, the two countries' alliance unraveled over the UAE's support for the Southern Transitional Council, a separatist movement that wants to return to the Cold War-era borders of Yemen when the country was divided into North and South. Just before the war in Iran broke out in February, Saudi Arabia launched strikes against the UAE's secessionist partners in Yemen. Likewise, across the Red Sea in Sudan, the UAE has backed the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary movement accused of committing genocide that is locked in a brutal civil war with the Sudanese armed forces. MEE was the first to reveal how seriously their ties were strained in Sudan, with a report that Saudi Arabia lobbied the US against the UAE for backing the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary. In all of these theaters, Saudi Arabia sees an attempt by the UAE to expand its strategic depth in the region by controlling strategic slivers of territory. Riyadh wants to preserve the status quo and fragile borders of the region, whereas the UAE sees these state institutions as a hindrance. On one hand, their geographies and histories explain their priorities. Saudi Arabia is the Arab world's largest economy. It is home to Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities in Islam. The kingdom also has vast strategic depth, the value of which has been underscored amid the war in Iran, with Saudi Arabia able to continue exporting 70% of its pre-war volumes of oil because of a pipeline running from the Gulf to the Red Sea. In contrast, the UAE is home to 10 million residents, of whom only 1 million are Emirati nationals. But again, there is another layer to their differences that goes back to how the UAE and Saudi Arabia view differences of opinion in their countries and within the wider Arab and Muslim world. Saudi Arabia was quicker to patch up ties with Qatar after the Gulf Rift. Although Abu Dhabi was a signatory to the 2021 Al-Ula Agreement, which officially ended the blockade, it has continued to have a chilly and suspicious relationship with Doha. The UAE says it is opposed to Islamists in Sudan and Yemen. Saudi Arabian analysts are quick to point out that Riyadh is dedicated to combating extremism and terrorism, but is committed to national institutions. Somaliland is a case in point. Saudi Arabia and most other Arab states were quick to condemn Israel's recognition of the Somali breakaway region earlier this year, whereas the UAE has military and economic links to the region and was quiet. Many diplomats and analysts say that Saudi Arabia is more attuned to the so-called Arab Street and building consensus, whereas the UAE is more comfortable challenging those norms. Look no further than Israel. Saudi Arabia says that it will only normalize ties with Israel if a Palestinian state is created. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman publicly said Israel committed a genocide in Gaza. In contrast, the UAE has deepened its ties to Israel amid the war in Iran. Some thought that Iran's attacks on the Gulf in retaliation for the US and Israeli war would mend fences between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. Instead, it appears to have galvanized them. The UAE is doubling down on its relationship with Israel, whereas Saudi Arabia is leaning into its ties with established regional actors like Egypt and Pakistan, in addition to Turkey. How Saudi Arabia and the UAE manage their differences and navigate these competing blocs will determine the future of the Middle East.
That was MEE journalist Sean Matthews. And for today, time for like, make you can email here every Tuesday and Thursday noon if you're in